Hello, I'm Peter Simmons and I'd like to introduce you to the wonderful world of scale model boat building. The boat that we're going to look at today is Veronica, a design that was drawn by Richard Chesney, the head of the Scale Model Barge Association. I built this one up to race in next year's season. Now we're going to go through the building process from the beginning, and so we'll start with the wood pack that you can buy from Traplet. The plans that are available from Traplet come in 7 sheets, very detailed plans, giving the general arrangement of the barge, showing all the deck fittings and so forth. One showing the sections, so if you choose to just buy the plans rather than the wood pack, then you can laboriously cut out your own sections. And also the profile, giving us the keel and shape and the positions of all the various frames through the boat. To speed up today's process, I've already glued up the keel, which comes in 4 pieces in the wood pack with a joint in the middle. You'll see I've glued it to the edge of my bench, or hopefully not glued it to it, because it's put down on gaffer tape, or duct tape as it's commonly known. Duct tape is wonderful stuff for gluing on because nothing will stick to it. So any glue that dribbled from the keel onto the bench would not stick the keel to the bench. Now I always start my building with a building board. It's a board that is rigid, and the great thing is that if you get another job coming in the middle of the work you're doing on the model, you can pick the whole thing up and put it somewhere else while you use the bench for another purpose. The board itself I paint just ordinary white emulsion. The centre line of the model is drawn down the board, and then I mark off at right angles the point of each of the various frames that we're going to set up along the length of the keel. The frames come in the wood pack ready cut out. These ones are actually laser cut, the black edge showing, but the ones you will have will be cut with a router, which gives us a much cleaner edge. The keel we glued up last night can be set up in the frames that I've already screwed to the board. So the other advantage of a building board is that you can screw things to the surface without destroying the surface of your bench. Next I take the frames, which I have marked up ready, and put little legs on each of the frames, the exact distance from the building board to the keel. So this is frame number 4, so that stands in there, thus, and can be clipped in place with clips or clothes pegs or whatever you happen to have to hand, and we can ensure that the frame is perfectly upright. We know it's square to the keel, and if we look along the keel now, we can make sure it's absolutely straight and the boat hasn't got a bend in it, which this one had very slightly. That's better. So that is frame number 4 set up. Now the frames for the middle of the boat have the main hatch ends shown on them as well. So this is now frame number 3. So that one goes in there in exactly the same way. We set up numbers 2, 3, 4 and 6, which are the 4 frames that hold the hatch ends. Each one has been put in place and clamped to keel and to the baseboard, and the first thing we must do is to check along the length of the keel to make sure it's absolutely straight, both horizontally and vertically, because any twist at this stage will ruin the barge for the rest of its life, I'm afraid. The next stage, having checked that everything is absolutely square and correct, is to glue those 4 frames into position. The glue I like to use is a PVA glue, white glue, but this particular one is not only totally waterproof to all sorts of British standards, but it is also a 5-minute super fast set, so it's very good for this kind of job. So I'll just apply some white glue to where it's going to join the keel, put the frame back into place, clip into the baseboard and clip him at the top as well where it's marked on the keel. There we go. We can work all down the line like this, each frame going in turn. And the last one up here, and then we can put the hatch sides on, which will then hold the rest of the frames rigid when we come to put those in place. The next thing I've made up are the coaming sides or hatch sides, which are going to hold the whole thing rigid. Now these are not part of the wood pack, but they're just simply strips of quarter ply which can be glued in either side here. So I'll now glue these in, fit in underneath here in the slots in the coamings that are already done, and the other one the other side. So they will remain in there, and then when I come to put the other frames into place, they will hold them rigid as well. So we can now glue the forward ones in as well. Now we've got the boat set up square on the building frame, we can turn our attention to the stringers. Now these are laminated up out of balsa wood, and for the chine stringer it only runs from frame 2 to frame number 6, because once you get beyond those points then we're into a curved shape and it would be fairly useless to actually have stringers through there. Now if the stringer runs through here, you can see at the ends it would be unsupported. So I've made up some little knees out of just ordinary pine that I happen to have laying about. In fact, I think this is actually part of the lid of an old wine case. These are glued on the frames to support the end of the stringer. So that just goes on there. Now you could just use blocks, you don't have to do anything as exotic as these little knees, but I like the inside of my model to look actually something like a real boat, and this is how we would have done it in the yard, building real boats in the era of barges. Admittedly in that era they would have been made out of oak, but we won't bother to go to that extent. Put that glued onto there, clamped, if it will, in place. Gives me a landing for my stringer. So now when I put that round there, I've got a good strong position for the ends of the stringer. So we'll glue that in place and then lay up the other 3 layers, because 4 layers of this make up a stringer. As we're doing this, the whole boat is becoming that much more rigid, and we continually need to check to make sure that everything is straight and square. One thing you can never have in a workshop, I've discovered, is too many little clamps. Around there. Hello, cut. That's why. Some of these lower sections are now in place and won't move because they're already glued, so I can again clamp these round. So that's our stringer now in place around the boat. We'll do the one on the other side, and then we will build up with a second layer. Of course, once the first one's in, it's just a matter of gluing and clipping each one of these in turn till you get a nice fair curve all the way around. And as I think I've already said, they can be sanded to the shape before we start planking. I've now moved on a stage with the barge. I've fitted the stringers all the way around as I was describing, and I've also fitted frames 7 and 8 and the transom, and half, 1 and 1.5 frames much closer at the forward end here, because there's quite a complex shape we have to achieve shortly. I've fitted the gunnel stringers around as well, so that they're all rigid, and if we take the clamps off, hopefully the glue will have well and truly set by now, and we can actually release the barge for the first time from our baseboard. And we know that the boat is correct without a twist in it, and that the keel is absolutely straight. So now it's time to start thinking about skinning the barge. I'm dropping it back into the base just for the moment, because it does help to have something to hold it still while you're working on it. Now, there are various methods of planking your barge. You could go to the full extent like the old barges were built, with 2 layers of pitch pine planking with a mixture of pitch and horsehair between, but I doubt whether you'll want to go that far. The method suggested on Richard Chesney's plans is to plank the boat with 32nd ply and then use basswood planking over the top to achieve the planked finish. I have to say, with all my barges, I've always built them and skinned them with 1/16 ply, as I'm not too concerned at the scale we are about showing a battered planked hull as the poor old barges would have been in their working lives. So we're going to go ahead and skin her with 1/16 ply. I have cut out some plank panels for the bottom and for the top sides, because this section here, the middle section that we've been talking about all the time, is basically a square box. When Thames barges first came to light in the 1700s, they were very much that, just a square box, and they were used for transporting goods from large sailing ships, world-girdling sailing ships, to the shore. They gradually evolved over the years until they became a more efficient sailing shape, and the barges that we're building today. You'll notice I have put down the centre here, either side of the keel, a stringer which will support the inner edge of the bottom planking. So these panels around go on there and will be glued down. Now, on sections 6 and sections 2, where we're going to change from just a single sheet of 16th ply into planking in 16th ply, I put a doubler on these frames to give us sufficient landing for it to glue down on. you will not be able to take the square single sheet any further than this, because as you can see it's starting to get quite a curve at that point. We've now got the bottom panel in place. As you can see, this is just a flat piece of plywood, so very simple to do. We now get to the more complex shape on the barge. As you can see down aft here particularly, we have a double curvature. It goes in and then round again, and we can't hope to get ply of any thickness round that shape, so we have to start planking. Now with planking, we can't plank in just parallel strips, because obviously the distance from there to there is less than the distance from there to there. So if we measure these two lengths, down there and down the stern, and say we have 1/2 inch planks at this end, then we can establish that we need 3/8 widths planks at this end. So I've cut one out here. This is plank number 1, and this will go on here and twist round. It doesn't twist that easily, but near enough. Twist round, and we can glue that one on there. And then as we work our way round, if we mark those widths, the 1/2 inch every so often on this frame, and the 3/8 every so often on this frame, as we go round, we then know that we're going to get a uniform plank width all the way to the top. So I'll glue this first one in place now. Plenty of white glue, because it's fairly gap filling. You'll note that I've actually sanded the back edge of this plank here off to a feather edge, because this is going to butt straight up to the keel at an almost parallel angle. So we need to cut some of the back of the ply away, otherwise you're going to have a step in the hull when we're finished. So I've applied glue along here, and I'll also apply it along the top edge of the plank, particularly at the after end on the ready sanded section. And this can now be clamped into place. Clamps are sometimes difficult to actually get to stay on these awkward shapes, but with a little perseverance you can achieve a reasonably good finish. Now that might need just a little bit of help there, just to pull it back to the keel. Whoop. There we go. So that's our first plank in place. Okay, now we've got this first plank in place. As you can see, after I clamped it, I then pinned it with just ordinary steel pins, which later, when the glue has gone off, we'll pull out and fill the holes. And we come to the second plank. Now this plank, as you will see, is not a parallel sided plank. I've had to curve the edge of it so that it actually fits snugly up against the other one. And each of these planks, as we go round, you'll find will get a more and more complex shape. But we can now glue this one in place. Of course, if you were building a conventional shaped boat as opposed to a barge, it would be planked all the way through, and the planks can take on quite complex shapes as they go through. So we'll glue this one in place. When planking full-size boats, very often the planks were anything up to 3 inches thick, and obviously it would be a devil of a job to bend the wood, if indeed it would go without breaking, to some of these complex shapes. So they had to be steamed, or more probably boiled, until they were pliable. This was done in the yard I worked in a length of iron pipe with a fire built underneath it, and it would sit there boiling the timbers away. If you got the fire too hot, half the water would come out of the end in a scalding jet. If you didn't get the fire hot enough, the plank didn't go soft. But once it was boiled for about half an hour, there would be a call from the shipwright foreman, and you would drag this red hot plank out of the pipe and rush into the shop with it and hand it to the men so they could bend it round the shape. Fortunately, with 16th plywood we don't have quite those kind of problems. So we'll just nail this one in place. And that one is another one ready to go. And we can move on to plank number 3. Again, its edge here has been shaped to allow it to fit snugly up against the other one. Again, just clamping with a couple of little clamps to make sure it's absolutely right before we nail it. More tricky around the back end here because we're starting out onto the transom now. So I'm not sure I'm going to get a clamp to stay on that one. Yes, we have. There we go. So there's plank number 3 in shape. As you can see, we've already started going from a convex curve here to a concave curve here, and then that will continue down until we get to this point here where it's a convex curve right the way through, but obviously the curve is different as you go through the boat. This is how we continue on down now to the gunnel line all the way along. Under normal circumstances I would plank up one for one and work down the other side as well. This helps keep the boat absolutely straight, and it's still worth looking along the length of the boat every so often just to make sure that nothing is getting pulled out of straight. I used to have a foreman at one stage who always used to say to me, "What do you think of that, boy?" And I'd say, "Well, it looks straight enough to me, governor." And he'd look along it and he'd say, "Oh, you've got an eye like a dead whelp, boy." And he was usually right that it wasn't quite straight, but we do try and keep things straight if we can. So we'll now move on. We've planked right the way down to the gunnel line. The planks all the way through. As you can see, they're not by any means parallel shapes. They're wider at this end. This can now be sanded down because it looks a little bit like a threepenny bit at the moment. And we achieve this, which is a reasonably good finish. It's not a perfect finish, I agree, but it is at least the shape we wanted. Having sanded it to there are still one or two low spots on it. So if I show you the bow now, the bow here I have used a car body filler on just to take the worst of the dips and hollows out of it, and that will now give us a smooth finish ready for painting. We can now turn the barge over and see the other things that I've done to the interior of the barge. The first thing I have done is to paint the whole of the inside of the barge with polyester resin to waterproof it and to further strengthen it. And to even further strengthen it in the bow section where it's planked, and indeed in the stern section, then I've used a fine mesh glass fibre mat to actually line the inside and strengthen it further. Whilst I was putting the stringers on, I put a breast hook in here, this little triangular piece, which just gives me something better to glue the bow with. A king plank down the middle here, and I've also put in a base for the mast, which is resting on a stringer across the forward side of the hatch. Further aft, I put in a strengthening piece here which will eventually take the false keel, and I've done the same at the stern here with the glass fibre mat. So we've now got a complete seaworthy waterproof, apart from obviously an exterior paint job, and very rigid hull form. There is absolutely no possibility that's going to twist any further when we put the deck on eventually. But before we do that, there are one or two fitting out jobs that we need to do, because it will be easier to get the items in before the deck surface goes on. The deck surface is only more 16th plywood basically put on in flat sheets. First of all, we need to think where we're going to put the rudder servo. The easiest point is going to be under the skipper's little after cabin, and that can simply go between those two frames there with the two push rods back onto the rudder head. This stern post will be cut down eventually when the deck is ready to go on. So the rudder servo can go in there. Next we have to decide what we're going to do about sail servos and how many we think we're going to need. I prefer lever arm servos, although some people prefer the rotary servo, which will entail mounting the servo in the middle of the barge with a running line around two pulleys and your sheets attached to that. So as the servo winds in and out, the continuous running line moves backwards and forwards and in turn pulls your sheets. As I say, I prefer the lever arm type, which simply moves through 90 degrees and so gives me about 5 inches of travel, which is sufficient for that. I use two servos for that, one for the main sheet and one to control the top of the vang. Both these need to be mounted in the barge so that the lever arms don't foul each other or indeed any other part of the equipment in the barge. Now the standard servo arm just about goes in that hatch, and that can then be mounted there and the other one further forward so that they don't actually get locked together at any stage. The next thing we need to think about is where we're going to put the battery. Again, personal choice. We're not going for lightness on a barge, so I like to use these small lead acid batteries, which will give me anything up to about 3 hours sailing time without a recharge. The best place to mount the battery is going to be directly above the keel, so we can build a little box for that just to drop in there. Remember, the whole of this hatch area here is going to be a lid which will lift off, so we have plenty of access to the whole of this area. So that's the interior of the barge sorted out. We obviously have to have a dry mounting for the receiver to go somewhere, but that can be clipped up on the bulkhead either end so it's well clear of any bilge water you may get below. The next item we have to think about is the rudder. Now the rudders on barges were very large, described a bit like a barn door, but unfortunately because of the depth of the barge they're not terribly deep. So we need to accommodate a rudder extension in the rudder so that when it's sailing we can plug in an extension. So this can be done very simply by having a piece of 1/8 ply in the middle, a piece of 16th ply on the side, and if we sandwich those three together, thus then our extending rudder can just fit into that slot with a pin holding it, and that will then give us a good rudder area for sailing, because barges don't tack that easily, but something of that size will definitely get you round. The real Thames barges of course were totally flat bottomed for a reason, so that they could work their way up shallow creeks and take the ground when the tide went out. Now unfortunately with models they don't always follow full-time practice, and in order to get your barge to sail effectively you will need a false keel. Now this can be made fairly simply. I like to cast my own lead weights, but of course these are readily available from the various yachting suppliers. I use a glass fibre mould, and this mould, although looking a little scorched, has seen a large number of keels through it over the years. The lead keels themselves have a hole drilled in them and a couple of pegs, so when I put it together the pegs will actually hold the keel in line, and next we need to be able to hold this onto the bottom of the boat some depth below it. So that can be done very simply by having a wooden fin made up thus with the bolt we're going to use up the middle there, and then if this is then fitted together with a good proprietary body filler, and then afterwards 30-second ply wrapped around the keel to give the shape. Here I have the finished keel for Veronica. As you can see, it's got quite a nice aerofoil shape, and as I said, this is done by wrapping 2 pieces of 30-second ply either side of the central core, and for this I use a glue called Gorilla Glue, which is a very strong wood glue and actually foams up. So when you clamp this round, the foam actually fills the slight void that you have either end here. You can see the bolt sticking out of the top, ready to hold it into the bottom of the barge. And we need to drill through the hull to be able to mount the keel on the bottom of the barge. So we'll drill through this strengthening piece that I've put in here, ready to take the keel, and insert a length of brass tube, which will go through flush with the bottom of the hull. It'll have a washer soft soldered onto the tube at the correct depth, so that takes the actual weight of the keel. And then at the top I like to put a piece of wood across here which will support the top of the tube and take the lateral movement that will be caused by the weight of the keel, and it also actually acts as a very good handle to lift the barge in and out of the water because it's directly above the main weight of the keel. Another piece of cosmetic work that we can do at this stage is the transom here is looking a bit ugly with these balsa ends sticking out through it. So if we cut out a piece of 30-second ply and put it across the transom there, and then eventually trim to shape, this then covers all the plank ends. Real barges would have had something exactly the same to prevent their plank ends getting damaged in the docks. And then we can put a decorative piece over the top like that, and then this can be picked out in a different colour, as many of them were, and the surround outside makes a fairly attractive finish to the barge. I always think that the stern of a barge is very often the prettiest bit of her. Okay, so we now got a completed rigid hull. She looks quite neat and tidy inside. The knees here that we made earlier show, and the whole thing looks fairly professional. So we can now continue with the fit out and start thinking about masts, sails, rigging, paint jobs, etc. to make the barge into the complete finished model. I've taken the hatch covers off, and we can see how they're very simply made. They're just purely a lid, like a lid on a biscuit tin, but with these ribs in here just to give a bit of curvature to the top of the hatch. They're covered in cotton material, which is the same as the sails are made of, and simply folded every so often to represent the overlaps of the various tarpaulins. Tarpaulins on a real barge were held down with a series of battens and wedges, and these have been made. I made one set and then made myself a mould from a material strangely called silly gum, which is a silicon which sets to a shape, very bendy, and these I've filled with car body filler, which takes about 5 minutes to go off. Popped them out, painted the brown and the black wedges, and there you have the finishing touches of the hatch. The fore hatch is made in exactly the same way, as is the stern hatch, which is a little more complicated, and I will talk more about that when we get to the rigging, but it's just a square box lid with a cover to go over the rudder servo. Underneath the after cabin we have the rudder servo, which you saw mounted earlier, and that is now on simply on a closed loop, push-pull onto the rudder blade. This will be all covered by the part of the hatch, the box that was built over the back there, and the completed rudder has got a rudder yoke here made out of thin copper strip soldered up, as are the rudder fittings themselves. They're simply a thin copper strip bent to shape and then glued either side of the blade with a 5-minute epoxy. The rudder extension I showed you earlier can fit in the bottom of the rudder, and just a copper pin, a bit of copper wire just through it, and the end tipped over so that the rudder extension can't drop out again. Moving forward to the main hold, we have a mounting for the receiver, which is not waterproof but at least splash proof. We have a servo here to control the vang, which controls the top of the sail, and another one here for the main sheet, which controls the bottom of the sail. So that if I pull the vang, let the vang out and the main sheet out, the sail comes right out, and then I can adjust the shape of the sail by either moving the vang in and pulling the top of the sail in, or I can go the other way round and I can pull the bottom of the sail in and get a different shape to the sail. Forward of the sail winch servo there is the internal battery. The main sheet, which travels across this horse here, which is a curved piece of wood which is actually curved in both directions. It's not only curved to the radius from the mast, but it also has to be curved to the deck shape, so that in itself is quite a complex piece to make. Once during my apprenticeship I had to make a full-sized one of those, which took me a couple of weeks with an adze out of a big balk of oak. At the after end here the traveller travels across the horse, but this of course gives us a 2-to-1 disadvantage on the amount of travel on the sail. So I have fitted a pulley to the end of the sail winch arm, and the other end is attached to the bottom of the boat, so when that sail servo moves it is actually a 2-to-1 advantage, so negates the disadvantage we had on the main sheet. You will also see that there is a clear perspex cover between the travel for the vang servo and the travel for the main sheet servo, quite simply so the two don't get entangled in each other. You can also here see the tubes that I've put in, or the tube that I've put in for the keel bolt. The reason there are two tubes in this one is that this is the main one for when she's sailing as a spritsail barge or staysail barge. If I were to put the big rig, which is also shown in the plans, with the bowsprit and extra foresails on, then we would need to move the keel forward very slightly to prevent weather helm developing. Okay, so that's pretty much for the interior. It's well worth keeping it as neat and tidy as you can. The main thing is to make sure the sheets don't become tangled in each other, and to keep all the wiring and batteries and servos as far away from any water ingress that you may get. So just before we put the hatches back on, just one thing, the hatch seal, there's a rubber hatch seal around the edge here. This is half round neoprene strip, which was bought from my local rubber supply company, super glued on, and when the hatch goes on that will be pulled down onto that seal to make sure that as little water as possible gets below. Barges were always known as wet ships in a sea, and you will find you get plenty of water on deck while sailing. Starting at the bow of the boat with the fittings, we have the stem band, which comes up here and wraps over the top of the wooden stem head, and fittings on either side to take the various rigging parts. Also we have a stem head roller for the anchor chain and an anchor, which this one is just cut from aluminium sheet with the flukes glued on with epoxy glue. And then moving up we have the bottle screw which tensons the masthead forestay, and we have the main tackle which allows the barge to raise and lower its mast. Many of these barges worked inland up rivers, and they would need to lower all the rig down to go under some of the low bridges. The barges that used to work the Medway particularly had to shoot through two bridges, a rail and a road bridge, and they would sail up to the bridges, drop their mast down, get carried through on the tide, and then have to hoist it up the other side ready to sail on upriver, which must have been a very daunting task using just the main anchor windlass here. On the other side we have the downhaul for the staysail, which is up here, and then we move on to the anchor winch itself. These were very solidly mounted on the boat. These two posts would have gone right down through the deck to the underside, and these big knees here would have taken the strain of, first of all, the dolly winch on top here, which was used for all sorts of purposes, and the main anchor windlass back here, all of which were geared and of course hand operated. We also have a couple of small cleats, one either side, for the downhauls and the mooring bollards. Also on the foredeck we have the hatch leading down into the forepeak, where the unfortunate mate would have lived, probably a very dark and damp hole. He had one little light which was let into the deck here, which is just simply a lacing eye filled with glue and glued into a hole. Now we move back to the mast area, which is a fairly busy area on the barge. Working from forward aft, you have the horse which takes the foot of the jib. Now this is a free running sail which just simply travels backwards and forwards across that horse. On the full size barges it was exactly the same idea, and was never adjusted in any way. We then move back to the tabernacle, which holds the foot of the mast, and that was used to hold the mast in place while they lowered the rig. The little winch here is the braille winch, which was used for hauling up the brails which furl the mainsail, but you never took the mainsail down on a barge. It was pulled up to the mast, and the main brail here would fold the sail back, and these lower brails and upper brails would bring it into a bunch so it hung here, and that was a sort of iconic image that you used to see of barges moored along the east coast. Also on the base of the tabernacle here you have the crab winches, which were used for hoisting and lowering the sails that did hoist and lower, as opposed to the main, which was brailed up to the mast. In the same picture you can see the bar across the deck here, which held the top end of the lee boards. Now these lee boards were big heavy lumps of oak usually, that were lowered down one either side of the barge to act as a keel, and they would be lowered on the lee side, the side opposite the wind, and hoisted on the windward side, and each time they tacked they would have to lower and hoist these big heavy lumps here. They were simply hung loosely on the end of that bar, so that when you tacked, the windward one would hang away from the side of the barge, a bit like a broken wing on a bird, until they had time to hoist it. The chain from the back of the lee board here, which lifts it up, comes up through a pulley and follows back along the deck down to these crab winches here, which are used for raising and lowering the lee boards. They also sometimes had another drum on the inside here, so they could be used for other purposes. We also have the main sheet horse here again, which we touched on earlier, mounted on two chocks with a traveller that runs backwards and forwards across it. Also on the after deck you can see on the starboard side there are the davits for hoisting the dinghy. I tend not to put the dinghy in these barges because it does get caught in other barges when you're racing, which is easy to do. The after end here, as I've already said, is the skipper's cabin. We have the skipper at the wheel here. I always like to add figures to my models. It adds the realism, I think. And the mate sitting here having a smoke. Mate, by the way, has a red hat. All barge boys or mates on barges wore red hats. It was a great mark of distinction amongst the young lads to know that they'd actually got a berth on a barge. The after hatch here supports the mizzen mast, and so apart from covering the servo to stop it getting blown over the side, the chimney stack here from the skipper's stove below actually unscrews to reveal a bolt sticking up through the hatch, and that actually holds the hatch down so that it can't get blown over the side. It's quite a good way of attaching these hatches sometimes, so that just the one bolt sticking up keeps the whole lot together. The after end of the skipper's cabin here covers the steering gear, and this led back from the wheel to a big worm drive under here, which would actually move the rudder. The mizzen is sheeted onto the rudder blade here, so that as the barge turns into the wind, the helm goes down, it pulls the mizzen up into the wind and so helps turn the barge round, because a lot of these barges had to sail in very confined conditions and it wasn't easy to turn them. The deck detail on this particular barge is simply the planks were scored into the plywood deck and then sprayed with grey paint afterwards. Most of the barges had painted decks because the decks weren't terribly waterproof, and it stopped it dripping on the skipper in his bunk and also wetting the cargo. The next thing on the list is the rigging, and this is a task that some people may find a little daunting, but it's really very simple. All the rigging on this barge is made out of fishing line or fishing trace wire. It's a stainless steel wire with a plastic film over it. Very easy to work and very cheap from your local fishing tackle shop. The bottom end of the rigging is held by chain plates, these bits here, which are literally just stripped brass and put through the hull with 10 BA bolts just bolted through onto the inside. Coming up from there we have a little shackle which I've made out of copper wire, and then these dead eyes here which are made of walnut. These are actually purchased. I have tried making them myself, but they're so fiddly and so cheap, I'm afraid I cheated and bought these. But these have a 3-part tackle through them so that you can tension each individual stay. At the top of the stay here there is a splice or a joint in the wire. The wire goes right round the dead eye and then continues up the mast. At the top of the wire it's actually a continuous loop which goes right round the mast, over the hounds here and back down to the next dead eye. This is the way it was done on real barges, and the 2 forward shrouds on this side went on first, the starboard side, and then the 2 forward shrouds on the port side, and then the after shroud and the backstay shroud here, which was adjustable at deck level, went on last. So again, just a small splice here which I will show you how to do in a minute. The hounds here, which not only support the end of the rigging but also support the topmast housing here, are actually constructed from 1/8 plasticard with a brass strip either side and a strap across the top just to keep the whole lot together. And you'll note that the hole in the lower hounds here is actually square, which stops the topmast twisting in its housing. The cross trees here on a real barge would have been hinged at about this point, and there would have been a halyard to be able to tip the cross tree up so that when the barge was dried out alongside a high dock wall, if it leant in slightly it wouldn't crush the end of the cross tree. On this one it's just a straight piece of brass tube, goes right the way through. Next we move on to the sprit, which is this spar up here which supports the top corner of the sail and the outboard end of the topsail. Now the pressure on this sprit was taken down to the muzzle round the mast. Now this bore enormous strain because of course the whole power of the sail pan was driving this sprit downwards. So this was a heavily constructed piece of material with great galvanized chains holding it down. It was stopped sliding down the mast by the stayfall here, which goes back up to the hounds. On this one it's constructed purely out of bits of copper strip and bits of copper wire soldered together. Going up to the sprit we have is the sprit support here, which is just a wire back to the main mast, and this is only here to support the sprit should you wish to take the sail off. Normally the weight of the sprit is taken on the head rope of the sail here. At the very top end of the sprit we have another strap round the sprit here, made from a strip of copper with a copper wire ring soldered onto it at the top to take the outboard end of the topsail, and then we also have a pulley here for the vang. Now on a full-size barge the two vangs will be separately operated, but in order to avoid yet another servo down below on these, I have one end of the vang permanently attached to the deck and the other end through the pulley at the end. Right at the head of the mast we have the flag, or bob as it was known, and this was different for every barging company. This is actually a made-up one, it's not a copy of the real one. This is my own fleet. That swirls around there. Coming down we have the anchorage point for the cap shrouds and the forestay, and also the block which takes the halyard for the top of the topsail. Coming down we have a series of mast hoops which allows this sail to be raised or lowered, and these are actually made up from a very thin shaving off the edge of a piece of pine, wrapped around a dowel and covered in glue and left to harden, and then you end up with a short tube, and you can cut these off in slices and make your own mast hoops. You can also of course buy these. One thing I would advise, if you're using mast hoops, whether they're homemade or otherwise, put them on before you finish any of this part. You can't get them on from the bottom because the bottom of the mast is square, and I have forgotten to do it on a couple of occasions, and it means dismantling everything at the masthead to get them on. So do remember to put these on before putting the fittings on. The mainsail, because it is never lowered, is actually shackled to an iron on the back face of the mast here every so often, and these again are little shackles that are just bent up from either copper or brass wire. So that remains permanently attached. One small point here, which is my own invention: bowses are used for tensioning rigging normally, but black plastic bowses on a scale barge don't look terribly good. So these are made from little tiny blocks of elm, and the halyard goes in the top of the block, comes down and picks up on a hole at 90 degrees and exits through the side, and then goes round something at the base and back up and is knotted off on this side. So you can actually, excuse my fingers for a minute, but you can actually tension or slacken the sail, and the finished article looks just like a block would be on a normal halyard. Now I've talked about the splices that we need to do in the rigging. It's very simple to do. This, as I said, is a piece of plastic covered fishing trace wire, and if we take it round in a loop, and then I take a perfectly ordinary piece of cable, electrical cable that's been stripped back to give me some thin copper wire, I can then wrap, I reckon 15 turns is about the right amount, around it. Doesn't matter if they're too close together or not, because you can slide them back together as you go. That's it. And then with a touch of solder on that, it will not only seize it into a loop, but it will actually make it look like a splice, which looks somewhere near realistic. The spars on a model sometimes present people with a problem. You can of course use tube or dowel, but a lot of the spars are actually shaped. The topmast there has got a square bottom end to it and rounded at the top, and the main mast itself is actually tapered slightly. So in order to achieve this, I find it easier to start from scratch. I have here a perfectly normal piece of pine deal, which is actually cut from the edge of an old piece of floorboard, and it's cut to a square shape, and then we plane it up to a hexagon shape, having marked off roughly where we need to leave a square. Actually the square bit is easy because that's the bit I'm going to hold. So if I just run the plane down the side here, one side, so we want to end up with all 8 sides roughly equal. And this point, if you wanted to introduce a taper into the spar, you can do so by planing slightly more off one end than the other. Doesn't take many minutes. There we go. So we now have a roughly hexagon shape to the main part of the spar. The other end I have left square because this is how I want it to end up. So we're going to be round from about here onwards down the length of the spar. So you now take an electric drill. I've got a battery operated one here, but mains would do just as well. Insert the spar into the end of the drill and then take a piece of sandpaper and a thick leather glove. The reason for this will become clear because the end of the sandpaper, or sorry, the back of the sandpaper actually gets very hot. If I now wrap the sandpaper around the spar and turn on the drill, I end up with a nice round spar, and I can, as I say, introduce tapers or leave squares or however I want. Now we come on to the most important part of the barge, the sails. Some people may feel a little daunted by this, but really they're very easy to make. They're only flat sheets. If you could make a pocket handkerchief, you could make a barge sail. The barge rules, if you're intending to race in the championships or anything like that, state that the sails should be made from non-man-made materials, and this is just plain cotton bought from the local haberdasher's store. Some of the sails obviously are tan, as the traditional barging colour, which I'll explain in a minute, and some of them are left white. This is the same material as that, just quite simply dyed with Dylon terracotta dye. The sails start off with sail patterns cut from paper, and the most important measurement on the mainsail is from the mast to the end of the sprit. Once your sprit is set up at the correct angle, then this measurement here governs it all. From there on, it's basically square. So you cut your paper pattern. I then stick it to the spars with masking tape just to make sure it lays right and looks right, and then continue with the other sails in turn. Once you've got your pattern, you can lay it out on your material, mark it off with either tailor's chalk on the dark stuff or even just pencil on the white stuff, and if you draw the outline around the paper pattern and then add two more lines 1/4 of an inch apart, so you get 1 1/4 inch, 1 1/2 inch, cut it out at the 1/2 inch line, fold it into the first quarter line and then the second quarter line, you will end up with a sail exactly the same size as your original pattern. Before stitching that, it's very often a good idea to put these dummy seams in here, which again can either be stitched in, as I've done here, in a contrasting colour so that they stand out nicely, or on the white sails simply pencil or biro lines will do. Having once put the dummy panels in and done your seams around the edge, it's a good idea to make sure that all the seams are on the same side of the boat, otherwise you get a bit of a conglomeration. Once the sails are made, it is well worth offering them up to the boat and making sure they still fit before you go on to the task of putting the bolt ropes on, which are these ropes around the edges. Now, on my earlier barges, I actually stitched all those on by hand, which is a very laborious way of doing it, but latterly my wife has discovered a zigzag stitch on our sewing machine that actually stitches them on for me. So I just have now to tack the bolt ropes on, and then she stitches them on. You'll notice that the bolt ropes actually only go round 3 sides of the sail on the mainsail. The leech, the back edge of the sail, is left without a bolt rope on it, as is the head of the the head of the topsail and the leech of the other sails. So they don't have bolt ropes round them. Incorporated into the bolt ropes are small eyelets, which are simply made by taking the end of the piece of rope and passing it back through itself to form a small eye, and then stitching on. I mentioned just now actually passing the rope back through itself to make the eyelets on the corner of the sail, and to do that I have made myself up a Swedish fid or gully spike, which is used in full-sized rigging, and this allows you to pass the end of it through the lay of the rope, and then you can feed the end through, slide that off the end of the gully spike, and there, depending on what size you want it, you have a perfect eye ready to stitch onto the sail. A large one for the head of the sprit, or a very small one just for where the sail is going to be chained on at the jib. When you come to attaching the sails, as we already talked about mast hoops, these are just quite simply sewn around the bolt rope, which will hold it well to the sail. On the mainsail, this, as I explained, was held with little brass shackles, which are just bent up from brass wire, passed through between the bolt rope and the actual material, and around the jack iron here on the back of the mast, and this holds the sail to the mast. Another tricky problem is actually getting the bulwarks, which are freestanding upright in a curved section around the bow here. Now on the first barge I puzzled for some time over that, but eventually came up with the idea of making a jig just out of an old bit of chipboard, cut to the exact shape of the bow, covering it once more in gaffer tape so glue can't stick to it, and then if you take 2 layers of 16th ply and glue them together around the jig, once removed from the jig they will then stay to the shape. You can cut them to the slight taper and round off the end, like here as it is, as I've done on that one. Clamp them down, and once the glue has gone off on there it will remain to that shape, and then it was just planted straight on top with 5-minute epoxy beneath and a couple of lead weights to hold it down. Okay, well that's just about all the construction work for the model done. We now need to think about painting. Now Thames barges came in numerous different colours and in fact changed colour during their lives. Different fleets favoured different liveries, and I've actually painted Veronica how she was when she was first built, with grey deck, grey top sides and black cove line and then red anti-foul below the waterline. I prefer to spray my models rather than brush paint them, and I use a Rust-Oleum spray can which comes from my local hardware store. They're about £7 a can, and 1 can will happily do a whole model, probably a model and a half. First of all, the whole thing is sprayed in grey, as you can see, and then carefully masked off with clean line masking tape bought from my local car spray shop, and sprayed first with matte black, and then below the waterline the anti-foul is represented by red oxide primer. The hatch covers, I said earlier, were covered in the same cotton as the sail material, with folds in. They were stuck down on a dilute PVA glue and then painted with, in this case, blue acrylic. A tarpaulin can be almost any colour, but these ended up blue. The cove line around the boat, the yellow line round here, is done with trimline tape that comes in tubs with various widths of line on them, and is quite simple to apply. The name on the bow of the boat is done on a Brother P-Touch tape machine, a bit like a Dymo tape, only the modern version of, and very useful for marking all sorts of things. And finally, the transom is painted black around the rowing boards here, and the actual transom was white, as in the real thing. And the two name boards, blue name boards here, are quite simply cut from blue insulating tape, and the name and the edging very carefully drawn on with a gold paint pen. This is Water Witch, another boat that I've built, but really to demonstrate that it follows exactly the same techniques as the barge did, except with this one, because she's all round bilge, then the whole hull had to be planked. You couldn't cheat slightly by using just flat sheets of ply in the middle. So the formers were set up on the bench as the other one you saw me do was, but she was planked with ordinary spruce or pine, which in point of fact was salvaged from the local tip, and the planks run full length. As you can see, there are some fairly complex shapes which can be achieved, both with a hollow at the bow here and also this somewhat peculiar shaped transom, but I can assure you that's how she was. She actually looks quite pretty on the water. The other thing I've done on this one is to give her a fully planked deck. Now that can easily be achieved, a lot easier than you may think, by taking the piece of wood you want to use for your deck, again the top of an old wine box I think, and gluing black paper to one side of the deck, the one side of the plank. Once you've done that, you can then cut planks off the edge of the piece of wood, and once laid down side by side, you will get the black effect of the pitch between the planks between each one, and just continue like that, and you will end up with a full-size deck like this one. It's worth noting that where the planking goes around the edge of hatches and so forth, there was always a covering board, which is a mitered section round the hatch. Okay, so now you've seen the construction of the barge, the greatest pleasure will be seeing her on the water, and that's what we'll do next. We'll go down to the local boating lake that I have on the Isle of Wight here, together with George and his mate, the skipper, and we'll see what sailing a barge is really like. Right, first thing to do to get all the rigging out of the way is to re-erect the topmast, which we had to drop to get it in the vehicle to come down here. That just slides up again and the pin reinserted in the bottom. Having removed the hatch, we can now fit the false keel with a bolt up through the bottom through the tubes that we showed during construction. So that just simply inserts into the hole, comes up through the bottom of the boat, nut on top, now our keel is fitted and ready for the sea. The other thing we need to do is to put the extension rudder blade on, so that just slots up into the bottom of the blade and the pin goes in and holds it in place. The original Veronica was built in 1906 for one Clem Parker and his estates on the Dengie Flats, which is the area between the rivers Crouch and Blackwater on the east coast. He had 26 barges in his fleet for carrying farm produce up to London and back, and the standard cargo would have been wheat or grain or whatever he was growing at the time up to London, and then London muck, which was the sweeping off the London streets, back down to the farm to manure the fields again. The fleet stayed together until 1932, when unfortunately Clem Parker died. He was much missed and a well-known East Coast character who for some reason insisted on wearing tropical gear complete with pith helmet on his farm throughout the year. The barge was sold to Everard's, who recognised her form as a racing barge. Racing for the barges was really an advertising stunt to make sure that they got the best cargoes. Everard's recognised her racing potential, and she was somewhere in the first three of most of the Thames and Medway barge matches throughout the 1930s. After the war, Everard decided to retire her from trade and keep her purely as a racing barge, and then fitted in 1953 an even bigger rig on her, taller mast, cotton duck sails, a bowsprit which was reputed to have been up to 45 feet long, half the length of the barge stuck out in front. And they raced her like that for 10 years, but the strain on the old girl was just too much, and she started to leak profusely and was generally being shaken to bits by this enormous rig. And so in 1964 she was sold off as a houseboat, and she was eventually berthed in Bedlam's Bottom, which is just off the swale at the entrance of the Medway, and I'm afraid rotted on her mooring, became uninhabitable as a houseboat, and her bones can still be seen sticking out of the mud if you're ever in the Medway area in Bedlam's Bottom. The barge in the shot now is a bowsprit barge, Celia Jane, belonging to Alan here. Are you going to race that in the coastal class this year, do you think?
I'm going to race it in the coastal class this year, yes.
Good. She looks fine on the water there, and the way she went past mine just now, she should do fairly well, I think.
It's a fiberglass hull with a wooden deck and aluminium masts with wooden tops.
What keel weight have you got on that one?
I got 12 pounds on the bottom of that now.
Right.
All up weight is around about 20 pounds.
She looks fine on the water anyway, and going well there with the light breeze that we've got.
I've got two controls in it, one on the mainsails and one on the jibs, so I can self-tack the jibs to help it go about.
Yes, you've got a clever system on that, haven't you, with using two servos?
Yes, 2 winches now. I've converted it to 2 winches. One works the 3 jibs and the other one works the mainsails.
Brambling in the middle there, which is not actually a Thames barge, looks very much like a East Coast smack or something like that.
Yes, it was a hull brought from a well-known website which was converted to a smack looking yacht.
Yes, she looks very pretty on the water there. Another one from a glass fibre hull.
Yes.
But I notice you've got a very deep cockpit on that. Doesn't that, when the wind is blowing a bit harder, something of a liability?
Not really, no. It can take some water in, but there is a secure hatch inside that keeps it off the radio equipment.
Oh, right,
right. I haven't known it to sort of fill up yet.
Gaff rig on that one with the spar along the top of the sail as opposed to a sprit which you get on the barges, which is a diagonal spar. It suits her well, she looks nice. And the sail material you've got there has got a slightly mottled effect, which of course the real ones would have. Because that's dyed cambric, isn't it, on that one?
It's dyed cambric, yes. And it's dyed in hot water, so the wax in the fabric affects the dye, and it doesn't always cover the material in an even colour.
Yeah.
And that's how I get the mottled effect, looking as though it's an old suit of sails.
But is that still Dylon terracotta?
It's still Dylon terracotta.
Yes, it's amazing the difference in the colour of the sails. If you look at Veronica with the very dark brown, your two with the cambric material, and I think Haughty Bell in the rear there must be a polyester material because the dye wouldn't take. It took something like 24 hours in a bucket of dye to get the sails even to that pale colour. They just look as though they're faded. They're ready for another dressing.
Yes, in hot water they only take an hour to come out that colour.
Barge in shot now is the model of the Haughty Bell, which is one of mine. Again, an entirely wooden built barge this time. The most unusual thing about her is the counter stern. She was the only barge ever built with a counter stern, long sloping stern, as opposed to a transom stern like all the other barges. She was built in 1896 by Pipers at East Greenwich, and she was built largely as a racing barge. Full-size barges were raced in those days because the man who won the race had the fastest barge and therefore got the best freights. So a lot of the companies used to have barges built specially for racing. Unfortunately, she was eclipsed the following year by another barge, Giralda, which went on to become champion of champions over the years. Haughty Belle, after some time trading with her counter stern, they found it got in the way in the docks, so they cut it off, and she was reduced to a normal shaped barge in 1906. She came out of service in 1932 and ended her days in Battersea Yacht Basin as a houseboat with two elderly spinster ladies living aboard. Unfortunately, Mr. Hitler dropped one of his bombs on it. The two ladies were blown out into the mud, but both survived unscathed. Unfortunately, Haughty Belle didn't. The racing going on here today is really just a practice for the Thames Sailing Barge Championships run by AMBO, the Association of Model Barge Owners, around the southeast coast at various model lakes throughout the year. There are 12 races. Lakes at Brightlingsea, Malden, Moat Park at Maidstone, Blue Water, and furthest south is the Southwater Dabblers near Horsham. But the 12 races go to make up points for the championships, and then the championships at the end of the year will accrue further points, and eventually there will be champion of champions at the end of each season. Cups and prizes are awarded in the coastal class, bowsprit class, staysail class, and then the smaller versions, which is the 30-inch class, or instead of 1/24th scale, which these boats are, it's 1/36th scale. Makes a handier model, but they don't like rough conditions. The barges are now creeping down towards the turning mark on this race. The barge in the lead at the moment has right of way, because the barge behind him doesn't quite have an overlap, and once he gets within 4 boat lengths of the buoy, he has right of way anyway. The barge astern and the little smack are well clear of him, so the object now is to get as tight round the buoy as possible and off on the other tack. If anything, he's left it a little too far away from the buoy, but barges don't turn very tight, so a big turning circle may be a good ploy. If he hits the buoy, he's going to have to do a 360-degree turn once he gets clear of it off the racing line, which costs you a surprising amount. Left it nice and tight on the buoy, so there's no room for the bowsprit one coming round behind him to get between him and the buoy.
Although,
in point of fact, Celia Jane will probably come to windward of him, and that will, if he can get ahead, because Celia Jane, being a heavier boat, is carrying her way better in these light conditions. If she can get up to windward of the other one, then it'll take the wind from Veronica, and she'll be able to overtake.
what wind there is.
Yes, unfortunately, very light conditions. Celia Jane's got to be careful she doesn't drift down onto the buoy and touch it, because then that will mean she has to do a 360-degree.
Oh,
Missed the buoy. All 3 boats bearing down on the mark again now. Veronica's round, still in the lead. Haughty Belle has caught well up now, but unfortunately Celia Jane, the staysail barge, has right of way to the buoy, so I'll have to go the long way round. We're going off here on starboard tack, chasing Haughty Belle down the lake. The sails are well out at the moment because the breeze is coming in over the quarter of the barge, at the back end there, and we'll just follow Haughty Belle down the lake. Diving round again to hopefully come clear of Celia Jane. Just letting the sails out now as the wind has shifted a bit and gone round behind us. Our own against Celia Jane at the moment. Perhaps a little more in on the foot of the main. Which will allow me to get a little twist in the mainsail. By pulling on the main sheet, it pulls the bottom of the sail in. And now the way Celia Jane's going away from me, that was not the right move. Try a little twist the other way. By pulling in on the end of the sprit with the vangs. They seem to be keeping up again fairly well now. Celia Jane's left plenty of room on that mark. So as she comes across in front of us, maybe I can cut the corner slightly and gain some of what we lost. We go. This will be a jibe round this mark. This particular barge has only sailed a couple of times, as I didn't finish her until just before the storms around Christmas time. But I'm quite sure that she will be a worthy competitor in next year's championship, which I intend to race her in. The racing is friendly, as are the members. We exchange ideas, we laugh and we joke, and the rules actually contain the phrase that racing should be carried out in a gentlemanly fashion, as well as the barracking, to enable all present to enjoy their day's sailing. I hope you decide you're going to build a barge from the plans available from Traplet and possibly from the wood pack, and that we may even see you on the barge racing circuit shortly.